In 1935, 7 years after the Tritonium, Lawrence Hammond creates the first mass-marketed electronic instrument. 5,000 electric Hammond organs are sold by 1940. Electronic music starts to reach a broader audience. 1935 also saw the birth of 2 pivotal German innovations, magnetic audio tape and the tape recorder. Together they would be a turning point. They would improve recording methods and allow for the advent of editing, splicing and duplication. The first use of turntables would be by John Cage for use in his composition Imaginary Landscape No. 1. His variable speed turntables played pure frequency tones and in doing so gave birth to the DJ technology.
I guess for me the early electronic artists that I've really engaged with would be people from the 50s and before. I mean John Cage, Stockhausen, Bernard Parmigiani, Luc Ferrari. I mean that sort of French GRM school was something that for me is particularly interesting, and I see those guys as I guess the pioneers of electronic music. They're working with tape, they're working with instruments I guess that we wouldn't necessarily perceive as traditional electronic instruments today, but you know during that period that was really what defined, the technology defined the articulation of the music in a way. So you're working with record and the skipping of the record or with the cutting of the tape, you know, it was the edit that really defined early electronic music. And that's what interested me, certainly those pioneers sort of playing with that idea and composing within that sort of framework.
In 1946, while the early pioneers of electronic music were exploring music production, radio broadcasting technology had also made inroads. In their wisdom, the United States broadcast the sound of an atomic test from the South Pacific on radio. Alexander Graham Bell's laboratory develops the vocoder in 1948. It provides the means to electronically transform the human voice. The 1940s was a pivotal era for electronic music, and its evolution as various schools of thought started to emerge amongst composers. A small handful of enthusiasts with no formal music training but access to sound technologies were also experimenting. In 1948, while working in Paris as an electroacoustic engineer for Radio Diffusion Télévision Français, Pierre Schaeffer, using the tape recorder, records various sounds from trains and organises them into a short composition he calls Railroad Study. To describe his approach, he used the term musique concrète.
Electronic musicians in combination with tape-based, that would have been the combination. It would have been recording electronic noises to tape, either manipulating that tape and actually then layering electronic sounds and at the end hopefully producing some sort of electronic work.
So were they splicing?
That would have been physically splicing, reversing, music concrete techniques where re-recording over and over the same material, re-recording it back out using speakers and then re-recording, miking those speakers to evolve sound, to make the sound into something else, unlike what the original source material was.
By the 1950s, special studios for the purpose of sound production had started to appear around the world: France, Italy, Germany, England and the United States. Interest in electronic music was becoming international, but these groups worked, for the most part, in isolation. Schaeffer's work at the Radio Diffusion Télévision Français resulted in the establishment of the Groupe de Musique Concrète and attracted a collection of avant-garde classical composers, including Messiaen and his students Pierre Boulez, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and George Barak. Groupe de Musique Concrète was concerned with sampling, producing compositions using recordings of natural and industrial sounds. The use of tape editing for musique concrète was clumsy, and Stockhausen and Boulez soon left to seek better technology, as they had become more concerned with making new electronically generated sounds. In 1953, Stockhausen joined the Norddeutscher Rundfunk, electronic music studios in Cologne, Germany. Working with Herbert Eimer, Stockhausen set out to create what they called elektronische Musik. In doing so, they coined the term electronic music. Their Stockhausen produced many seminal compositions, starting with Studie 1, then Studie 2. In 1958, the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center in the US introduced the Rca Sound Synthesizer. Engineers Harry Olson and Herbert Bellar made it programmable with a typewriter-like keyboard that punched commands into a 40-channel paper tape using binary code. This was followed by the Rca Mark II synth that contained oscillators and noise generators. It was the size of a room and required a considerable amount of time being programmed before music would play. While at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, Daphne Orem became the first woman to produce a synthesizer. Her invention worked using a novel approach she called the Oremex technique. Her synth was put to work for the BBC TV studios, along with other world-first technologies. And Orem's synth would be used to generate the very well-known sound of the TARDIS for Doctor Who TV series.
The challenges were the absolute expense of the equipment. It was outrageous. So it was almost seemed as elitist because it was relegated back to universities, and who actually then had the time and access to the rooms to get in charge of these machines to create what we consider today very basic compositions.